Hello and a very good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody wherever you are. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone and thank you for your interest in BioConnect Academy's first webinar on the fundamentals of biometrics. We are really thrilled with the response and the amazing participation from so many. It is my sincere hope that you will find the session interesting, informative, and engaging. In today's session, as you all know, we are going to be discussing a lot about the basic nuances of biometrics. We will talk, among many other things, the two types of biometric functionalities. We'll have a brief peek into the development of biometric knowledge and technology. We will look at the design of biometric systems, how do we evaluate biometric systems, and finally, some of the use cases and applications. We have a dedicated session for question and answer, and that would be at the end of this presentation. So I would request you all to hold your questions till the end and feel free to type them in the chat window. I will be trying my level best to ensure that all the questions are addressed, and I welcome your follow-up queries later via email too. After our presentation, we'll be sharing with you a recording of today's session and also a very brief survey. We would really welcome and encourage your inputs so that we can do our best to better cater to your needs. With that, let's begin our journey into biometrics by getting onto the identity highway. What is identity? Identity typically, from a psychological perspective, when we look at it, it talks about the attributes, the qualities, beliefs, personality, looks, um, and expressions that make a person or a group. Categorizing identity can be in two levels. Like from a psychological perspective, it relates to self-image, self-esteem, individuality. From a physiological identity perspective, however, it relates to an individual's physical attributes, the color of your eyes, your face, gait, etc. This identity determines who we are and what we gain access to in our day-to-day lives. So, what is the problem with identity as we know it today? Imagine a typical person, and this person lives in an apartment, drives a car, works in a multinational company, has access to various government facilities like healthcare, and typically does a lot of their day-to-day activities, including shopping and all of that. Now, this person's access into the apartment that he or she lives in, the car that they drive to work or anywhere else, is by virtue of possessing a key. They log into their workstation using a password. They gain access to protected facilities in their workspace by scanning either their ID card or a fob or entering a few digits from an RSA token. When they go to access any government facilities like healthcare or file their tax returns, they have to produce some sort of a government identification. And likewise, when you go to purchase anything, you present your debit and credit card. So in all of these transactions, the access that the individual has to a resource, whether it is a physical or a logical resource, is by virtue of possessing what we call suspected identities. Any person who has the said key or an ID card can then gain access to either your apartment or your workspace. So here, the number of suspected identities that we carry around is so humongous that on an average, we identify that each individual may carry anywhere between 25 to 50 forms of suspected identities. Essentially, in this quest to prove who we are, we see that there are primarily three aspects through which we establish our identity and thereby our right to gain access to physical or logical resources. One is what I know, typically represented by either the passwords or pins. The second form being what I own, being either a device like a mobile phone, an RSA token, certain documents, keys, fobs, and finally, who I am. Thus, in many ways, my access to these resources can be determined by a combination of either one or more of these factors. Biometrics determines who I am based on my physical and behavioral attributes. So why biometrics? Biometrics is not something that is unique to human beings. Nature has very meticulously constructed these individually distinguishable attributes into many organisms. Consider, for example, zebras, leopards, or tigers, for instance. No two of these animals bear the same stripes or patterns on their body, thus making them uniquely identifiable. So when we define biometrics, keeping this in mind, as a characteristic, we talk about biometrics as a measurable biological and behavioral characteristic that can be used for recognizing an individual. When we talk about biometrics as a process, it is the automated method of recognizing an individual based on measurable biological and behavioral characteristics. These biometric modalities are of many types. And of course, we classify again based on the physiological and behavioral attributes. So primarily based on the physical attributes of an individual, some of the biometric modalities that are presently in vogue are, of course, the fingerprint, face, eye or retina, iris, hand geometry, vein patterns on your hand, and even DNA. When we talk about behavioral characteristics, these behavioral characteristics are primarily something that an individual has acquired or learned over a period of time. These attributes include handwriting, speech or voice, gait, signature, and even keystroke, the way you use the keyboard or even swipe on the phone. All of these are examples of behavioral modalities. Another interesting factor, actually, apart from human beings, the only other animal that has distinguishable fingerprint patterns on them are the koala bears in Australia. So now that we know that we have all of these ways of determining a person's identity, biometric processes eventually filter down to one of these two buckets. One is verification, the other is identification. Verification is essentially determining that an individual is who he or she claims to be. It is typically a 1:1 comparison. For example, when I show up at a biometric device and I present an identity card claiming that I am Praveen, and at that point of time, I present a probe biometric of either my face or my fingerprint, and that biometric is taken up and compared to the enrolled biometric of the individual whose record exists on the database corresponding to that ID. And if the probe and the enrolled biometrics match, then it is determined that this person is who he or she claims to be. So that's the 1:1 comparison. That is what verification or authentication typically refers to. However, when we talk about identification, identification is a process where we find whether a given person is present within a set of identities. Typically, there are two types of sets that we consider when we talk about identification processes. That one is the open set, the other is called closed set. In an open set, we don't know whether the person who has presented the probe exists within this set or not. So the quest here is to find out whether the person presenting the probe modality is present in the system. If he is, who is the one that matched closest with this probe modality. In the case of a closed set, it is already known that the individual exists within the database. And therefore, it can be used as a way to measure the performance of a biometric system, because the biometric system then has to determine the right match for this individual. And one of the key applications for open set identification processes would be the watch list. So anytime during customs and border protection, when an individual presents your biometric modalities, a comparison is usually made with a list of suspected identities of either internationally required criminals, to ensure that the presented biometric modality does not match with any of them. And at that point of time, the system essentially does not know whether the probe being presented belongs to the system or not. So that's a classic use of an open set identification process. So now that we know that there are all of these various ways through which biometric modalities can be used to either identify or authenticate an individual, the question then rises, how do we determine which modality has to be used? And here, thankfully, there are certain key international parameters that have been recognized, called the desirability factors, which play a significant role in determining which of the modalities should be used for biometric purposes. The first of this is universality, which refers to the degree to which a modality is present in all or nearly all of the population of interest. Uniqueness, it talks about measuring how well the modality can be used to distinguish one individual from another. The number of independent features in a physical or behavioral trait increases the probability of uniquely identifying an individual from one another. For example, if you consider something of an attribute like, say, face, which is a universally present biometric attribute. However, hair, on the other hand, is not so universal. Uniqueness, again, talks about the same thing. If we were to, say, determine by the color of the hair, how unique would this attribute be if I were to use this to determine an individual uniquely? It's not possible. Unlike, say, the DNA patterns. The third attribute is permanence, and permanence essentially talks about the degree to which a modality is resistant to change from factors related to aging, disease, or injury. And here, one of the key aspects we can talk about is, again, face. Relatively, compared to a lot of other modalities, or even eye, compared to a lot of other modalities, they are quite permanent unless there is any physical damage that an individual is going to go through. Otherwise, significant changes within this modality takes an extended period of time to occur. Collectability refers to how easily or the degree to which this modality can be acquired and stored. This is not an absolute feature. For example, collectability of face, and especially in the present day and age when people are so willing and open about capturing their own face images through selfies and all of that, is pretty open. However, if we consider collectability of DNA samples, that is not that straightforward and requires a very actively engaged user participation for this. Performance is a measure of how well the modality performs in determining the identity of an individual. The two key parameters of evaluating the performance would be speed and accuracy. How fast and how accurately can this biometric modality help in identifying this individual? Acceptability talks about how comfortable the subjects are in providing access to their biometric modalities. Circumvention, of course, as the attribute itself outlines, it is about determining the degree to which a particular biometric modality is liable for spoofing. For example, if you would want to try to spoof using your face, it is not that straightforward. Unlike, say, if you're a really good mimic, chances are that you can easily be able to mimic somebody's voice and get through. So voice is pretty open for circumvention. Typically, of all the known biometric modalities, fingerprint, face, eye, which could either refer to the iris or the scleral portion of the eye, the white portion of the eye, and voice. These are the most predominantly used biometric modalities in many applications around the world. BioConnect's own mobile authenticator supports finger, face, eye, and voice biometric attributes. There are several products actually being introduced into the market right now, and there is a lot of continued research also going on into exploring other modalities such as hand geometry, palm print, and all of that. Now, let's make a brief segue to understand how biometrics has evolved over the centuries. If you think about biometrics, really it has been the form of recognizing individuals since ages immemorial. Probably ever since humanity and intelligence dawned, we have been using biometric concepts to really identify one another. However, the first documented biometric recognition process is from the early 1850s by Sir William Herschel, who was a magistrate in India. He was a British magistrate in India, and he is credited to being the first European to use fingerprints for recognizing individuals. It was an interesting observation he made when he recorded that people in India seem to have a much stronger sense of binding to a contract when they gave their fingerprints instead of merely signing on the papers. However, the focus and the seriousness for leveraging physical attributes for identification was brought forth by Mr. Alphonse Bertillon. He was an officer in the French police department, and he was so renowned for his time that even Arthur Conan Doyle credits him and actually recognizes his genius through none other than his creation, Sherlock Holmes, who considers Alphonse Bertillon as equal to him. Alphonse Bertillon introduced the now famous anthropometry or Bertillon age, which is the process of recording measurements of various physical attributes. The whole process of like where you capture the mug shots and measure the various body parts, such as the breadth, the length and breadth of the head, length of the middle finger, left foot, forearms, from elbow to middle finger, eye color and length of the little finger. All of this process that I'm sure a lot of you have already been familiar through a lot of the crime series and investigation and movies and all of that. That was the contribution of Alphonse Bertillon. Further on, Sir Francis Galton, who incidentally is a cousin of the renowned Charles Darwin, who proposed the evolution theory, as well as Sir Edward Henry. The contributions of Sir Francis Galton and Edward Henry led to the seriousness with which fingerprints were considered for biometric identification. Particularly, Sir Francis Galton brought out the 10-finger system of classification, which was further enhanced on by Sir Edward Henry and is now known as the Henry point classification system, where the fingerprint patterns are classified based on the ridges in the formation of the minutiae on these fingerprints. All of this process led to an established science of biometrics, where it was determined that using these attributes, we will be able to effectively determine the identity of an individual. However, the process of automating this whole determination was something that gained a lot of traction when with the interest for criminal investigations and use of biometrics for a lot of FBI related activities and investigation. Post the tragedy of 9/11, there was a significant uptake for determining using biometrics for capturing international terrorists and use of biometrics, particularly for customs and border protection. All the G6 nations brought in biometrics to screen individuals who are trying to get into the country. And with that, and from there on, when Apple introduced Touch ID as a way for users to log in or gain access to the mobile phone, it brought biometrics to the fingertips, literally the fingertips of multiple individuals around the world. And with this, biometric gained widespread recognition and acceptability. So now that we understand the path that biometrics took all the way to its current phase where it is widely being used, how about we learn a little bit more about biometric systems and how do we design biometric systems? Traditionally, biometric systems would always be determined based on the need of the use case that is being solved. Who are the end users? Which is the target population which is going to be using this biometric system? What environment do they operate in? And based on all of these factors, what are the biometric modalities that are most suitable to be used here? Once this is determined, traditionally, every biometric system is going to contain the following components. There has to be a sensor and data acquisition system, essentially the point through which these biometric modalities are captured, whether it is a camera, whether it is a scanner, through which the user is going to present the modalities for enrollment or for verification or authentication. Once this data is acquired, the biometric modality is acquired, it has to be processed in order to determine whether the biometric modality meets the quality constraints or the requirements through which it would be possible to determine the individual's identity. So there has to be a signal and image processing system that ensures that there is sufficient quality within the captured biometric. And if there is a need for enhancing some of these features through signal enhancement process, and then extract the salient features such as the ridges or the venal patterns on the biometric modality, and through that generate the templates. These templates are then going to be stored and used for matching. The enroll templates and the probe templates are then going to be matched with one another, and based on the outcome of the match, a decision is going to be made whether there is a match or no match. And based on that decision, there would be a few other processes that are going to kick in, what can be grouped as administration processes. These processes would determine either whether an individual should be provided access to a resource or locked out or denied access to the resource. That's a traditional biometric system. And here you can see one of the representations where an individual is providing the biometric modality. Here in terms of the fingerprints, it's a slab. They are scanning all 4 fingerprints. And based on that on the screen, you will be able to see the quality measurements being represented through the green bars, indicating whether it is a good quality or not, whether it is acceptable or not. And all of this will then be determined to use for segmentation to determine which of those fingerprints, what are the fingerprints that are present on that slab. Correspondingly, on your right hand side, you would be seeing the same representation for iris. And iris scan here, essentially, it's a high definition camera. It's a iris scanner, but typically it is just a camera that captures a high definition image of the user's eye, and from which the iris templates are going to be extracted. While we spoke about the traditional biometric system, in this current day and age, there is more traction being gained for mobile biometric systems, with the flexibility being offered by advanced mobile devices that are available in the market. A lot of the processes such as data acquisition, image processing, storage, and matching is all now localized to the handheld device of an individual. Typically, when you want to enroll your biometric modalities on a mobile phone, you can use the camera, the microphone present on the device to enroll your biometric modalities. The templates that are generated are stored securely on the device, and the matching can happen on the device. When certain solutions do provide for server matching, the templates that are captured on the device can be transferred to a different server where the matching can happen at that location and the decision is conveyed back. But a lot of solutions are now available which are happy to do the matching right on the user's device so that the templates never leave the individual's phone. The decision is then conveyed, and the administration system, whether the user is trying to gain access to, say, a website or not, or whether trying to gain access to a physical space, can then be determined. Now that we understand how these biometric systems are going to be designed and what are the components, one of the key questions a lot of businesses which want to incorporate biometrics into their solution would ask is like, how do we determine that this biometric solution is working accurately? Testing a biometric system essentially is all about testing how accurately the biometric system identifies an individual. And when we are determining the quality of a biometric solution itself, typically this determination is carried out on a fixed database. And biometrics as a technology is inherently probabilistic in nature. So rather than say that biometric system is saying that this individual is, say, Praveen, what the biometric system is essentially saying is that there is a high confidence that the probe modality matches with that of the individual named Praveen. So with a high probability and confidence, we can say that this individual is Praveen. Essentially, what I'm talking about here is hypothesis testing. In null hypothesis, the probe and the enrolled sample are both believed to be the same, whereas the alternate hypothesis would be that the probe and the enrolled modalities are not the same. Correspondingly, if we put this into a 2x2 matrix, we come across the combinations which determine the types of errors that are possible from a biometric system. And from a probabilistic perspective, we typically talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 1 error is where a user is falsely rejected, meaning that the individual is who he or she claims to be, but the biometric system says that they are not. Type 2 error or false accepts, where the individual system is, the individual is clearly not who he or she claims to be. It's an imposter, but the biometric application determines that they are who he or she claims to be. That's a false accept. Typically, type 2 errors are far more significant and present a grave security risk than type 1 errors, which are more of an individual inconvenience. But however, if an undesirable or a potential malicious imposter gains access into the application, that's a much bigger security threat. Correspondingly, some of the measurements and ratios that exist in the within the biometric system to evaluate its performance include false match rate, false non-match rates, false positive identification rate, false negative identification rate, depending on whether you're talking about an authentication process or an identification process. Correspondingly, there are also other types of measurement accuracy measurements, which include failure to acquire rate or failure to enroll rate, which are measurements of how well a biometric system is able to capture the biometric modalities. Failure to acquire talks about whether the sensors are able to capture high quality biometric modalities, whether it is of a face or fingerprint. And failure to enroll talks about after you have captured a sufficiently good sample, is the biometric system able to enroll it properly in terms of like generating all the templates and then storing that into the database. So anywhere along this process of capturing the modality all the way to enrolling and then using it, there are quality measurements that exist across all of these processes. And finally, when we talk about decision error rates, there are error rate measurements that talk about false acceptance rate and false rejection rate. These are some of the quality measurements that exist within the biometric sphere. And now if we come to the applications and use cases for biometrics, of course, in this current day and age, there are so many areas within our day-to-day lives, all the way from government to using our emails that are relevant for where biometrics can play a significant role. Within government and military for gaining access for individuals to gain access to either health services or financial services, there is always going to be a requirement for proving one's identity, and biometrics offers one of the most secure and also convenient way for establishing the identity of an individual. For data services, gaining access into data centers and servers that contain a highly secure and sensitive information, biometrics can establish the authenticity of an individual who is gaining access to these resources. Financial services, one of the use cases that has been addressed even by the solution offered by BioConnect, includes where when an individual is transferring money from one account to another or doing some overseas transfer, each of those transactions can also be authenticated by an individual to prove his identity, that the one who has initiated the transfer is who he or she claims to be. Whether we are talking about retail for making commercial purchases, in gaming, in hospitality industry, education and public services, enterprise security, gaining access into a building or a protected resource, high-tech and telecom, healthcare, where it helps establish the identity of the patient. One of the key problems that exist in healthcare is identifying the right sort of treatment that has to be given to this individual, and therefore determining who this patient is, what is the problem, and how it has to be addressed. Gaining access to sensitive health records, all of these are use cases where biometrics finds a lot of relevant application. There are already several use cases that exist in our knowledge right now in the world, some of which include civil ID. For example, the Aadhaar project, which is the Unique Identification Authority of India initiated project for providing a unique civil ID number for the 1.2 billion population of India, is the largest biometrics-based project to be undertaken in the world. For criminal investigation purposes, FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system that I had already alluded to earlier. Of course, for access control, for physical and logical access, for time and attendance, which is one of the most popular applications where fingerprint and sometimes even face is also being used for time and attendance solutions. for consumer identification as part of government regulations in order to gain customer information. Biometrics is also being applied over there for surveillance system as well as for border protection. These are all some of the most popular use cases that we see being used in our day-to-day lives today. So with all of this, we do understand the application and the relevance of biometrics in this age. However, if we were to envision a future on this very identity highway that we started off with, where initially we spoke of an ecosystem that was focused around just the means of accessibility, what we can call as the accessibility ecosystem. From that, if we were to change our perspective and try to look at an identity ecosystem where the environment still remains the same, but now this very individual who had to carry on him several suspected identities can now reliably and conveniently gain access to all of those amenities and resources just by virtue of being himself. By using their biometrics, an individual can establish the authenticity of their identity and thereby gain access to all of these systems. That is the future that biometric envisions. With this, we have come to a conclusion of today's presentation. We are now open for questions, and if you have any questions, please do type that in, and I'll try and answer as they come by. Yes, it is possible to get a recorded version of this presentation. In fact, soon after this presentation, we will be sending the recorded session to all the registrants. Yeah. In terms of secure devices, I presume you're talking about ways through which you can enroll users or authenticate them. Are you talking about gaining access for, say, a physical space? So biometric readers, there are several biometric readers and manufacturers that exist. BioConnect, of course, has a partnership with Suprema. So Suprema readers are the ones that BioConnect offers to a lot of their customers. Apart from that, you also have several other biometric readers which are being offered by several other competitors. There are devices that are being offered by Morpho, which also, depending on the kind of modality that is being used for the biometric solution, you'll be able to find a lot of these offerings. But BioConnect itself, it offers Suprema readers for both fingerprint as well as for face. Standardizing biometric technologies is it is I think at this point of time a bit of an uphill task, because a lot of biometric vendors would like to ensure that they have their own patents, they have their own template standards that they would like to enforce on. While there are, of course, internationally recognized biometric template standards such as ISO, there are international standards such as FIDO, FIDO2 that are all being brought out in order to ensure interoperability, in order to kind of define a way that all of these can seamlessly interact with one another. It involves all the different businesses to really come together to make their templates interoperable. At this point of time, not many vendors are willing to support that sort of interoperability. But yes, another way would be to have the templates be um, make it possible for the templates to be converted into an ISO format, and then from the ISO format to any other format that the end user would prefer. With regard to subdermal chips versus using biometrics, when you talk about chipping people, that's a terminology that I'm not very familiar with. Would it mean that you're referring to having personally identifiable information on chips? And is that what chipping people mean? I would like some clarification around that. So, when one of the questions that I have here is what remedy is in place to curb the problem of biometric readers, BioConnect readers not working if the server would go down? So, typically, here, if for whatever reason the server is not available, the readers do default into a local only matching. And so that is one of the remedies that already exist in order to ensure that people are not held off if for whatever reason the server has gone down. So there is a question where, in terms of one is to many, just to kind of like clarify around the usage of this one is to many authentication. It's not typically authentication is always about one is to one. So what we are referring to here as one is to many would talk about the identification process. And there is a lot of preference amongst businesses to fall back into a finger only process of identifying an individual. So rather than have an authentication process where the end user presents first an ID card, followed by, let's say, their biometric modality, a lot of businesses would prefer that they do away with all of these ID cards and fobs and everything and just have the user present their fingerprint and then identify who that individual is. In terms of this, a promising technology where additional credentials such as user ID or PIN would not be available, there isn't a straightforward answer for this, unfortunately, because determining something like that in terms of technology would depend on what modality are we talking about, and therefore is defined by who the end users are and what is the business case here, right? So a lot of times, if let's say that this is for a business that operates in a corrosive environment where the end users are constantly either washing their hands or working with certain chemicals and things like that, where their fingerprints are not going to be reliable enough. So in these cases, you cannot really be using finger only as a way of gaining access. So at that point of time, you would want to adopt a better biometric modality such as face, which is not as sensitive to these kind of erosions and to these kind of influences where you lose the quality of your fingerprint. So for those kind of situations, it is always better to fall back on, say, face. If you want to use, if you want to completely do away with additional credentials like user ID or PIN. Mr. Michael, for the subdermal thing, I think whatever I would be saying, it's going to be more of a personal opinion. BioConnect does not offer subdermal, it's not in the business of subdermal RFID chips. So I would not be able to give informed comment on that right now. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, that if the server is not available at any point of time, then the readers to fall back for a local only matching. So that way, the users can still continue. The business continues and they will be able to gain access because there is local matching happening instead of server matching. Are there any other questions at this point of time? We can take the last two questions. Is fingerprint or card supported in BioConnect? Yes, we do support. For physical access, we do support both of it. There is an option whereby the user can choose to provide a card followed by a fingerprint. Yeah. Or just provide only the card or provide only fingerprint. So there is a question by Francis. What is WDMS in biometrics? I think WDMS itself, it's like basically web-based data management systems. And it is more of an integration of WDMS in biometric. I think that you would probably be interested in, or that is what you're probably referring to. It essentially means that it's more of a cloud offering where the biometric device can actually be physically located elsewhere, and the data management and all of that is happening in the cloud. So that's a web-based data management system, and when you integrate that into biometric, then you don't require the biometric actual device to be present in the same place. It can be anywhere. There's a question, what specifically gets sent to BioConnect server for authentication? It depends on what are we referring to here, whether it is going to be BioConnect's mobile authentication or mobile authenticator offering does not send any template to the backend. As I said, all the authentication activity is happening on the individual's device. So nothing ever in terms of templates get sent to the backend server. However, when we are talking about the physical access system, then for authentication, the templates, if there is server matching enabled, then the templates will be transferred for authentication and matching purposes. Yeah, Anthony. So those are all the options. Card only refers to just using the card to gain access. Card and biometrics is essentially, as I mentioned, the 1:1 process. And 1:1 would be that the user first presents the card, and followed by that, they present their probe biometric modality. And card, biometric, and biometric only means that you are open to card and biometric, as well as presenting just the biometric only, in which case it is going to be an identification process that will kick in instead of a 1:1. So would server matching be a sort of backup? It's, yeah, I mean, either server matching or local matching. Since if the server is not available, everything falls back to device only at the local device matching. So they both act as kind of like a backup for one another. If server matching is the preferred way of matching that the business wants, then yeah, you can treat local matching as a backup, and vice versa. Which is the best time and attendance device suitable for schools that can be used to alert parents? I don't think I have an answer for this. We haven't evaluated particularly time and attendance devices suitable for schools in order to alert parents. I would have to understand what exactly is the use case here. Is it in terms of if a student has not shown up at the school, then you send an alert to the parent. And if that is a case, then typically this is something that can always be built into the existing system. Once there is a detection that happens that an individual, a student, did not show up at the school, then immediately the solution, whatever has been implemented, can be enhanced to send a trigger or an SMS or an email to the parent. Yeah, but I'm not aware of devices that are going to do that automatically for the purposes. I'm sorry about that. What is the average file size of a template? That really depends on which modality you're talking about. Typically, they are going to be very, very, very small, in the order of a few kilobytes. I think This I would like to thank you all for your interest and your engagement with the session. We really look forward to hearing more from all of you. Thanks again, and we hope you found this session useful. Have a good day.